Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster here from the Wood TV live desk. Black History Month is this month, folks, and we're here with Alex Forist. He's telling us a little bit about an exhibit there at the Grand Rapids Public Museum. Now, this exhibit kind of just celebrates diversity in a whole. It's not specifically for Black History Month, but there are some certain exhibits that we are going to go over here. Alex, first, I want you to introduce yourself. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm Alex Forist, one of the curators at the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and excited to be here today to talk about our Newcomers exhibit.
So we have some specific shots here, folks, that you're able to see there between us of some pieces there in that exhibit. Tell me a little bit about the exhibit as a whole.
Sure. So Newcomers, the people of this place, is one half of a pair of exhibits that really talk about the people that have called and still call West Michigan home. So there's Anishinaabe, the people of this place, which is about the first people of West Michigan, the Native Americans who lived here. And then Newcomers is really about all the immigrants who came later. And so it's meant to be a really broad story that tells a lot about the reasons why people would have come to Grand Rapids, what that transition would have been like, and how they've made home and community here.
I think one of the most interesting things, we were there earlier, is just how hyper-local it is to here in West Michigan, Grand Rapids especially. Each of these pieces kind of has that own significance. Tell me, let's go over just some of the individual pieces there. We talked about, I think, maybe 5 or 6 of them. Let's go over a couple, whatever one you want to start with.
Sure. So the exhibit, in order to be easily understandable, it does take sort of a chronological focus. And so, as historians and museum people, we always like to talk about the firsts. And so one of the first African Americans that is documented as having been in Grand Rapids is a guy named J.C. Craig. And J.C. Craig was born a slave in Tennessee, and after the Civil War, like a lot of African Americans, found the South to be not a very hospitable climate for Black people, and so migrated to the North, and eventually found his way to Grand Rapids, where he became a pretty successful business person. And at least according to his own advertisements, he had what was Grand Rapids' first electrified barber shop, which means that he was a barber in Grand Rapids and ran a shop that had electric lights, which would have been a pretty big deal back in the 1870s, 1880s.
And, kind of just highlighting a little more of that significance of it being actually here in Grand Rapids, what does that mean for people who come by to actually see it?
Yeah, so, of course, during Black History Month, we think it's important to highlight and tell these stories, but really the cool thing about Newcomers is it's one of the core exhibits of the museum, so it's there all year round. It's always there for people to come in and sort of experience these stories and learn a little bit more about these folks. So I think that that's really the goal with any museum exhibit, is to get folks engaged enough in learning that they can then sort of ask the next best question for themselves. Hey, what do I want to learn a little bit more about? And really what we have the expertise and what we can offer is those specific stories about Grand Rapids and West Michigan, and the people who have been our local heroes or made a difference somehow here in our own community.
We have one of our shots here, and it's a bunch of hats. It should be coming up here, I believe, in just a few seconds, maybe 15 seconds or so. But tell me about that one specifically. I really like
sure.
that one.
So this is a collection of hats that belong to a woman named Lynn Riptoe. And we tell the story of her and Alice Coleman, but these are they're the church crowns, especially for Black women here in Grand Rapids, and like anywhere else. This was a real source of pride in terms of being able to dress up on Sunday and really show off. And so that's the thing about an exhibit like Newcomers. There are definitely serious stories in here, sad stories, but there's also meant to be fun and lighthearted ones to talk about just what was daily life like, what were some of the sources of pride, the fun things to do that make community. And so that's kind of what we want to show by showing Mrs. Riptoe's hats.
And then there was one specific one that I also wanted to hit on as well. It was, for lack of a better word, a story about real estate. The one at the end there, if you want to talk about that one.
Yeah, it doesn't, when you say it that way, it doesn't sound so exciting, but this is actually really a really important story that took place in Grand Rapids, and it's the story of the Auburn Hills neighborhood here on the northeast side of Grand Rapids. And so what we find is that in many cases, there are stories in Grand Rapids that we can tell really well that mirror larger stories in our nation. And in this case, the story is about restrictions placed on housing for Black Americans. So in Grand Rapids, like most other cities, there was both by sort of tradition and by law only specific neighborhoods where Black people were allowed to buy homes. And that was mostly historically on the city's southeast side. And what we actually found out over the course of doing the research for this exhibit is that wasn't just a tradition in Grand Rapids, it was actually part of the rules and regulations. We have in the exhibit a document that shows a home in Grand Rapids that has what's called a restricted covenant. And that means that it's literally written right into the documents. It would be sort of like the equivalent of an HOA rule today. And in that document from Grand Rapids, it says this house can never be sold to someone who is not a member of the Caucasian race. So really this process that you might have heard about in other big metropolitan areas called redlining, basically keeping minorities restricted to certain areas, it absolutely took place here in Grand Rapids. So the sort of good story or the counterbalance to that is about the Auburn Hills neighborhood, which was developed by a group of 4 African-American businessmen who decided that that was unacceptable and that they wanted to create a neighborhood, a nice middle-class neighborhood in Grand Rapids where Black people could buy homes and raise their family and just live their lives. They themselves said that it wasn't meant to be an action that was part of a civil rights movement. They just wanted to be able to live. And so that's really the story that we tell here, and it's mostly told through clippings from the Grand Rapids Press newspaper from the 1960s and 70s as they went through that process to buy the land, build the development, and a lot of the hurdles that they faced.
What was that specific, what were those pieces? What was that specific name of that one called again?
It's called the Auburn Hills neighborhood.
Gotcha.
And so it's on the northeast side of Grand Rapids. It still exists today. It's kind of between Leonard and Knapp.
Gotcha.
And just east of Fuller.
Getting these pieces for these certain exhibits and kind of just putting them together, how do you go about even just getting that?
Yeah, so all the exhibits that you see at the museum are made up of collections. And the Grand Rapids Public Museum has been collecting for 167 years. We've been part of this community since 1854. And so we have about 250,000 artifacts that we care for that we can use to create these exhibits. Now, when we do an exhibit like Newcomers, which actually opened, I believe, in 2008, there's always needs to be a really active part of community collecting and reaching out to people in the community to make sure that we're telling the stories that they want to hear about their communities and that we're showing the things that they want to show. And so an exhibit like Newcomers, is partly pulling things out of the vaults that maybe have been there for a long time, and it's partly that outreach to community to collect new things for the museum that can be included to make sure that those stories are diverse and accessible.
Alex Forist, again, a curator with the Grand Rapids Public Museum there. Alex, is there anything else that you'd like to add here?
Like I said, I think the museum is a great sort of first stop for people to learn a little bit about Black history right here in Grand Rapids. But I'd definitely be remiss if I didn't mention a few other places that people should check out. Definitely the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives right on Monroe. And then if you're really interested in this topic, reading a little bit deeper, picking up a couple of books by folks like Randall Jelks, who writes about African Americans in the Furniture City. Todd Robinson's book, A City Within a City, really tells the story of the 20th century African Americans in Grand Rapids. So those would all be great resources for anybody who wants to dig deeper into this topic.
And ladies and gentlemen, attached to the stream is a link. It'll take you over to woodtv.com. You'll be able to watch our conversation here again, if you want to reference back to it at any point. Again, this has been a look at the Wood TV Live Desk. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster. Alex, thanks for taking some time.
Yeah, no problem.
Folks, we'll see you around. Have a great afternoon.